Okay, here we go.
Here we go. Live and for real this time. I like that. We'll wait well, we're almost at 10:59. We'll get going here in just a second.
And actually, if yours is like mine, we are a bit about 2 or 3 minutes slow.
Well, my computer is very odd, and we have somebody who's here.
Hello.
Hi, Brenda.
Hey, Brenda.
Good to see you. My computer is running like 2 or 3 minutes slow, and I go in and I change the clock, and it's fine for a little bit, but then every
Yeah,
time my system updates, it goes back to the wrong time. It is so
yeah.
annoying. It's supposed to
That
always
happened when
be
Chris
right.
updated my clock too. Yeah.
Dang it. Anyway, well, since we're at 11 o'clock, we're going to get started, and we are actually remembering to record this today. What a concept. And I am glad that folks are showing up, and I'm sure that a few more people will continue to show up. And again, all of these are going to be on our website so people can pop in and take a look whenever they want. I know that it's difficult sometimes to carve out time, or you think you can make it, and then a meeting comes up or an emergency or whatnot. So we get that. And really, part of the reason we're doing this is to have the information posted to our website so folks can access it whenever. So today we're talking about professional self-advocacy, and let's jump in. So most of you know what we who we are and what we do and why we do it. We are working primarily with neurodivergent teens and adults, their families and their allies and employers throughout their lives. We're located here in Santa Clara, California, but we have clients literally all over the world. So hosts today, moi, Jan Johnston-Tyler, founder and CEO of EvoLibri, and Keith Halperin, talent and placement expert. You want to say howdy, Keith?
Howdy, Keith.
Very good.
You
Very,
ask, I deliver. That's how it
that's
works.
right. That's right. So the topics for today, self-advocacy, professional self-advocacy. And this is an interesting topic because, self-advocacy isn't just standing up and demanding. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. So we're going to break it down. So we're going to talk about what is self-advocacy. We're going to talk about in relationship to self-advocacy, some of the fundamental underpinnings, one of which is self-awareness and the power of self-awareness. We're also going to talk about reasonable expectations and how they fit into self-advocacy, and obviously, to some degree, help to determine whether or not you're going to be successful in your self-advocacy. We're going to talk about professionally communicating needs. And of course, the word professionally there is important because how we might communicate our needs to our children, to our loved ones, to our parents, to our friends is going to be very different than how we frame things in the workplace. And we're going to talk about building allies and credibility, and what those really play into our ability to self-advocate in a meaningful and productive way. Keith, you want to take this one? These are some potential scenarios.
Yes, here are some of them. Accommodations. Asking for accommodations requires self-advocacy to help others understand what you need. You know, if you don't let them know, how will they figure it out? Okay. Promotion, yay or nay. There are times when we want to be promoted and times when we do not want that additional responsibility. That doesn't happen too often, and you know what you want, but sometimes it does. Reputation, very important. There are times when we need to self-advocate because one or more people seem to misunderstand us or our actions. And last and certainly not least, pay raise. Common one. Sometimes we're looking for a bump in our pay. Back to you, Jen.
Excellent. Yeah, and I wanted to mention just really briefly the promotion one. I've seen this happen several times in my career both careers, I should say, where somebody was up for a promotion to management and they really did not want to be in management. I saw this a little bit when I was in tech, but I'm seeing it more now as a counselor, where people are being promoted into management really more by sheer dint of longevity, that they've been there the longest, but they don't feel that they have the skills or really the desire to manage people. Yet oftentimes they're kind of pushed into those roles, even though they don't think they're going to be terribly successful. So it's something to be on the lookout for.
Yes. Also, one thing that's been traditional, at least in the tech field, it may be less or more true now, is often that people who are individual contributors feel that they, even though that they are very good at what they do and they want to continue it, they feel that if they don't go into management, which they may not feel all that comfortable or competent in, they're going to lose ground. They're not going to get promoted. They're not going to be making as much money. So it
Right.
basically forces them out of what they're good at and like into something that they're not good at and don't really like.
Exactly. No, that's so true. And some companies have solved that problem by having sort of two different tracks, right? So there's the managerial track and the individual contributor track. And if a company is well managed, in my mind anyway, people should be able to continue to grow their career in a individual contributor role over time and not be, air quote, forced into management to really continue to climb the corporate ladder. But yeah, it's a problem. There's no doubt about it. So when we're talking about self-advocacy, again, as I mentioned earlier, you got to start with yourself. You have to understand who you are. And what we're demanding of you, if you will, is to be clear-eyed, understand your strengths, knowing who you are and what you are truly good at. And that's an ongoing process, right? And there's a lot of ways you can find that out, but review what you hear from other people and really think about what type of work for you is enjoyable and where you feel you succeed the most, right? All of us have parts of our jobs that we don't like, we don't feel we're terribly good at, but we all have to do for whatever reason. That's okay. It's not that necessarily you're going to get rid of the things you're not fabulous at, but you should have a really good idea of what you are really good at and what others consider you to be really good at. Also, the other side of that is equally true. Understand your weaknesses and know what you're not good at and own it. Don't make excuses. Don't blame other people. All of us have certain areas that we're not super great at. So first you need to own that, really understand that it is not your strength. And secondly, if at all possible, learn to grow so that you're better at that. For example, I always tell people I have a slight math disability, and yet I can run a company. And I was doing multi-million-dollar budgets back in the day. And I could do those things with great, I won't say difficulty, but it was painful for me. I didn't like it, but I got really good at it. Today, part of being a business owner is doing bookkeeping and accounting. Again, I absolutely hate it, but I'm pretty good at it. And I'm pretty good at it because I had to own the fact that I wasn't good at it. And I had to learn how to do it, even though it's not my favorite thing, like at all. And understand how others see you. This is critical. And I think for neurodivergent folk, it feels a little scary. Uh, Mainly, I think, because we are concerned that people are devaluing us because they don't understand us. They may have bias against us. And all of those things can be true. I'm not trying to discount that. But I think it's also important to recognize that in a workplace environment, there are ways we can always build our credibility and improve how people see us. And I think that it's really important to understand that. How are we adding value at work and in our relationships? What are we offering other people? We're going to dig a little bit deeper into that as well. Keith, any comments on this one?
Yes, going back in a little bit over about knowing your strengths and weaknesses, I think it's, as you said, sometimes it's very important to understand where a weakness is and work diligently to overcome them. I think what may be hard for neurodivergent and probably neurotypical people too is to say, well, this is something that I'm not particularly good at. Should I, A, work very hard to get better at it because I need to do it, or I don't want to do it, I'm going to avoid it, I'm going to make sure that somebody else handles that. That's a hard question to answer, and it has to be answered individually. There's
That's
no
true.
clear answer to that.
That's true. I do agree. There are certain things, that, I could never be an accountant, for example. I'm not good enough to do that. But in order to do the job as it's outlined, I did have to learn a little bit more, right? So part of this is, how much wiggle room do you have in your job to say, I have a true disability in this area and I simply cannot do this. Can I get an accommodation so that it's
Hmm.
essentially a job card so somebody else owns this? Or is it such an integral part of your job that you're actually going to need to learn at least some of the skills, right? And as Keith said, every situation is different. That's the kind of thing, if you're working with a job coach, if you've got an ally, that you should definitely talk to them about. Very good point.
Thank you. Okay. Everybody's favorite topic, feedback. Okay. Learn to accept, if not love, feedback. Well, not all feedback is accurate or fair. Most of what we get is not intended to be mean, but intended to help us succeed, at least in the eyes of the person hearing it. Okay. Feedback, particularly from management, are the areas where we are not perceived to be meeting the needs of the company, whether that's interpersonally, productivity, or quality of our work. Actually, I'm going to sort of disagree with this particular statement.
Okay.
That would be, it could be, feedback can be positive or negative.
Good point.
So you can say, hey, you're doing a great job. Keep it up. We're very pleased with you. That's feedback. That's positive feedback. So while it's often interpreted as being just negative, it can be good, it can be bad, it can be positive, or it can be negative. So that's what I thought. Okay. So if the feedback is less than what you feel to be positive, try not to get defensive. Feedback is one of the few ways you can understand for whatever reasons we are not filling the needs of our employer. Okay. And when you're listening to it, that you're gathering information, nothing else. You don't have to be reactive. Just ask questions, ask for specifics, ask for time to consider what is being said. Okay. And do that. You know, talk to other people, really think about what you have heard before you respond. In other words, the overall point is listen, think about it, take it in, and don't get defensive. And then, you have plenty of time to react. Just don't, do it immediately. One thing also that I'm not disagreeing with here, but it isn't included here, is often it's really important to find out what kind of feedback or how you are going to be getting feedback from someone. For example, there are some people whose default setting is in dealing with feedback, hey, if I don't tell you anything is wrong, you're doing okay. Other people say, I'm going to tell you exactly how I think you are doing, good or bad, to a great, level of communication. And often if someone is expecting a great deal of communication, often neurodiverse people such as myself, often like to have a clear idea of how we're doing, and we don't hear anything, then we get rather nervous. So I think it's very important up front to find out what you're going to get, in what manner, how much, and how often. And that can improve a lot of situations when you know that. So,
Very
any
good.
thoughts from that?
Yeah, I would
Lead-in?
say, and this is something that we coach on, which makes everyone nervous, neurodiverse and neurotypical, and that is learning to invite feedback, right? To actually ask for it. which people are like, oh, but they might, have criticism that I don't want to hear. Well, yeah, but if the whole goal is being a better, worker be better at your job, then we have to get that information from people, right? That is really, really critical. And, it it takes a thick skin to hear some of the messages. But again, if we realize that none of us are perfect, all of us are learning, all of us are continuing to grow, then the only way we can continue that process is by getting information from other people. Not the only way, but certainly one of the ways, right? Excellent. Good stuff. So, self-awareness is self-acceptance. As I was just saying, none of us are perfect. Understanding what we are not good at is just as important as understanding what we excel in. It is really, really critical. You have to know your weak spots and either accommodate for them, learn to grow into them, or just accept them if there's little you can do. It is really important because if you don't know what your weaknesses are, you're likely going to get blindsided. Somebody's going to say, you did a really crap job in this one area, or people are finding it difficult to work with you, or people are concerned that you're not keeping up, with the workload. If you're not able to understand that about yourself, really kind of looking out at, seeing how other people are doing, not to compare yourself with them, but just understanding the culture in your work group. And if there's some deviation that you're experiencing, other people are likely going to notice that too. And it's better if you see it first. We all have room to grow. Each of us have areas that we will need to work on throughout our lives, truly, to reach our full potential. I know even at age 66, I've got plenty of stuff that I need to continue to work on, right? I am not by any stretch of the imagination perfect. And whatever you do, try not to compare yourself to other people insofar as I don't want you to think, oh, this person got a raise and a promotion, but I'm working just as hard. Or you believe you're working just as hard. There are all kinds of subtle differences in how you're working, how the other person's working, what projects you're on, what projects the other person's on, et cetera, and so forth. Worry more about who you are and how you can grow yourself rather than what's happening around you. It's good to know what other people are doing, but don't compare yourself. And remember, life is never set, and neither are we. The minute we stop learning, our lives are pretty much over. Growing in our professional lives means we are always searching, always looking for something new, and always learning. So constantly evolve and try to do it mindfully and proactively. Anything on that, Keith?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, when we were talking about none of us is perfect, I gave an example of what is often heard. It's like other people don't feel comfortable around you or something to that effect. And to some degree, it's not like that is what someone is doing, like saying you're not working quickly enough or, your work is not up to standard. But in a fair amount, it says that's not what we do, it's who we are. So if someone were to hear something like that, where it sort of fundamentally affects their nature, what's a good way of responding?
For that type of situation, and we've actually had a few clients who were like that,
Mhm.
it's coaching. Job coaching can really help because it's safe and it's personal and it's protected, right? So we've
Mhm.
had people, for example, who've come to us who um, tended to be very negative, um, rarely smiled, rarely showed happy emotion, were kind of grumbly individuals, and
Mhm.
they noticed that people kind of steered clear of them. And when push came to shove, or when push comes to shove, and there are layoffs or promotions or whatever, these people felt that they were unfairly singled out, not to get a promotion or to be laid off. And so it is a process of discussing with people or with these individuals, how does the world see you? And oftentimes it's doing reflecting, right? So we do some role play with them. We help them to understand. Once, a long time ago, I actually recorded a person and asked them to reflect on their body language, their facial expression, and their tone of voice. And I think it was pretty shocking to them, right? It's like, wow, I kind of am a grumpy Gus. And so helping people to understand, what we're projecting into the universe has an impact is, I think, useful if you do it in a safe and compassionate way, right? And for this one person that I'm thinking about, they were so serious about work. They just so wanted to be successful. And part of it ended up sending them to a therapist to work on stress and anxiety, because what was driving that intensity and that, kind of grumpiness was, the fear of being let go. And so working on the rest of this person's life, having more hobbies, having better relationships outside of work, lightened the mood a little bit, so that the person was, one would say, perhaps, overall a little bit happier, and be more able to be a little bit more open in the workplace, so that he was seen as being approachable. How this comes out in performance reviews is the term unapproachable. And that's kind of the death knell, right? Because when we're working in any kind of environment, oftentimes, we're working collaboratively with other people, or at least they need to come talk to us or ask a question. And if people are fearful of doing that, that's a problem, right? So it's not that we want to change people's personalities. We were never going to make this person sunshine and light, and that's fine. But we had to help them understand how their presentation to people at work was impacting their performance. If people weren't coming to this person and asking questions that only he had the answer to, that's a performance issue, right? Because he's the guy who knows nobody wants to talk to him.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that the person necessarily was neurodivergent either, right? I've met plenty of people who are like that.
Grumpy Gus's, yeah.
Indeed. Anything else, David?
We're going to hit a little bit more if we have time for that. So,
Sure.
and you say we got to go on. Okay. We're saying what I am hearing you say then, and I think I'm reducing it more than what you're saying, and you're probably not, but you'll correct me. So I'm saying, if you are a grumpy Gus at work, you need to mask it until you become less of a grumpy Gus at work. I don't think you're saying that.
No.
So I want to have a little bit of more clarification.
So I would say, I don't want people to mask, but I want them to know that that presentation is impacting other people and could be impacting their work. So one way around that is, to try something different, right? And this was something I did with somebody, this was 6-7 years ago, where he had a reputation of being difficult and unapproachable. And so I said, what about bringing donuts? I knew there was a donut store right around the corner from him. I said, why don't you bring donuts every Friday? And he's like, I love donuts. And I said, yes, and other people love donuts too. This was before the pandemic. And he's like, that's a great idea. I can do that. That changed everything, right? Because now he was the grumpy guy who brought donuts. So it's like, so it was cognitive dissonance to some degree. And people are like, well, the dude brings us donuts, so maybe we're thinking about him wrong.
Yeah.
And it really did help, right? So I'm not saying change your personality. I'm saying find a way to make yourself more approachable. Yeah, a workaround. And the other thing to do is just, be, clear and transparent with people if you're comfortable enough. I have autism. That means I'm autistic. That means that sometimes I come across as really intense. I don't feel that way inside, but I know sometimes that's how I look. If you have a question, come ask me. You're not bothering me,
Mhm.
right? So that's another way to handle it. There are definitely workarounds.
Yes, that's good. Very good.
Perfect.
What you talked about sounds like what I heard, everything like George Foreman grill. How did that come about? Don't know if it's true, but I heard George Foreman was like doing cooking because at some point, either before he was famous or maybe even after his career is down, he felt that people weren't all that, interested or coming around. But by getting food for people, he became more likable, popular, etc. You
Isn't
bring
that
food,
funny?
your score is going to go up with other folks.
That's right. That's right.
Assuming they don't get food poisoning.
Yes, well, hopefully not. I love my little
All
George
bets
Foreman
are
grill.
off.
All right,
Okay.
let's
All
move
right.
on.
Onward.
Onward.
Okay. Okay, now we're going to talk about what's reasonable in the workplace. Okay. So negotiation. Understand that any time you're advocating yourself, you're engaging in a form of negotiation with the other party. It's not a one-way street. It's like that. And we need to understand where they're coming from, and as do they need to understand where we're coming from. So in order to negotiate, we need to have an understanding of what they expect and need. If we don't know, if we're not hearing saying, we can simply ask them, what are you looking for in this particular situation? What type, can you tell me in more detail what kind of, work you need me to do? And the details about that, things like that. Okay. And this drives reasonable. Knowing the job, the company, the culture, and you might be able to form a basis of reasonable. And nobody's going to really learn it uh, all at once. It's going to be an ongoing process. But being active and finding out as much as you can at each stage before you get hired, shortly after you get hired, and as you are going through your career, that tends to work well. And a way of doing that is, often to just, reach out to people you see and say, something, blah, blah, blah. Can you tell me a little bit about how we do that here or things like that? Nothing confrontational, just, I want to, see what the lay of the land is. Or that manager seems particularly gruff all the time. Is he really gruff? Or is it, no, he's having a bad day. That's the sort of thing. Finding out from people who've been around um, in a non-confrontational way can often be very helpful in helping you learn these things. So, Jan, comments on that?
I would say, yeah. And one of the things that popped into my mind just now as you were talking is this is when and where perhaps a mentor comes in. If
Hmm.
your company has mentoring programs, or if you happen to know one of these sage people who's been around for a while, they're a good person to approach and find, form an alliance with because they know what's possible and what's not possible, right? And every company is a little different. The culture is a little bit different.
Hmm.
In some companies you have free reign. Other companies are much more by the book. No, you have to do it this way. What came up for me also as I was listening to this was, one client that I've worked with, actually a couple, have been put on call, and being on call can be really troubling for neurodivergent folk because everything's real time. There's very little time to process, to sort through data, kind of think about it. You're on right now. And for people who have a difficult time both speaking and thinking extemporaneously, it's a real hard job.
Hmm.
However, these two people I know, one asked to be removed from call, the other one asked if they could skip so that they only did call every other time. And it was difficult. The one who really struggled, the other one was not struggling quite as badly, but the one who really struggled, unfortunately, had to continue. And really, what it came down to is everybody was being put on call. This was a new corporate dictate, if you will, and there was no way out of it. He tried to get accommodations. He tried to do a bunch of different things. Nothing worked. And what the company said is it is reasonable to have all of our senior programmers on call. So it's unfortunate, but to the company, it was not a reasonable expectation. The other person was able to skip, and it was short term. They ended up hiring some more SEs or post sales engineers, so that they didn't have to do the call, but for very long. But it was real painful, very painful. All right, let's move on. Sorry about that. Sometimes my mouse works and sometimes it doesn't. All right, so let's look at some reasonable versus air quote unreasonable. So, and here comes the on call. So asks, here's what the person wants to ask for: work from home 2 days a week, less on call, less meetings. So even if the company has a return to work policy, it very well could be you might be able to negotiate work from home if you can demonstrate that you need uninterrupted time to do your work, and can prove that every time you're in the office, you just cannot carve that free time out. You might be able to negotiate for fewer meetings if this is a burden. I know that this happens frequently where you're invited to every meeting possible. And when you look at it, it's like, some of these are redundant. Some of these, I have nothing to say in them, and yet, I'm still there. These are the kind of things that you can definitely talk to your manager about to advocate. Look, I'm in these meetings. Whenever I'm in a meeting, I'm not getting work done. That's really what it comes down to. And you might be able to get yourself out of rotation, for, doing less call, or get out of the rotation entirely. You can always ask. And those, I think, are reasonable. Now, asking for 100% work from home when the whole company has demanded everybody be on site is going to be a hard ask. It's not impossible, but it's hard. No meetings at all, no on call, and you want to meet with the manager 2 times a week to make sure that what you're working on is what's important. These are not impossible, but they're much harder to justify. And so you've got to be careful. I think some people, when they're asking, particularly for accommodations or trying to self-advocate, they think they're buying a car. And it's like, well, you go with the rock bottom, right? You ask for everything, hoping that you get something. I don't think that's acting in good faith. I think you should only ask for what you truly need, and then be really vigilant about fighting for that. I think that is better. On-call and meetings are duties, again, that everyone typically suffers through. Can you reduce it? Potentially. But if your goal with the one-on-ones twice a week is, well, I'm not going to the meeting, so I don't know what's happening, so I need my boss to tell me what's going on and what I should be working on, then you're shifting the burden of not going to meetings or going to meetings on your boss. And that's not going to fly. And I've had people try to do that. Well, I can't go to the meetings because I can't get work done, but my boss needs to meet with me to tell me everything I would have learned if I were in the meetings. No, that's not how this works. And remember, these are negotiations. You're negotiating when you're self-advocating. They can't be demands. If you come across with demands, the chances are very good that maybe not right away, but over time, you're not going to be working there. That's, certainly been my experience. Keith?
Yeah. Only thing, what about, and I guess it's probably a place where you don't want to work, is if if it's considered anybody asking for anything, is a no-no. It's like you take what you get and you deal with it without question. Sometimes in a place like that, it's probably not a place that many people want to be in, but sometimes they're stuck with that. And unfortunately, that may need, that's an important consideration. Are you willing to put up with situations that you can't even ask for an accommodation? Again, that's an individual choice. It varies from circumstance to circumstance.
Yeah, and we're hearing a lot of that right now, aren't we? And I think that companies are kind of getting away with it right now, only because the job market's pretty darn tight in certain sectors. But that's not going to last forever, and employees have long memories. I have seen many companies struggle to find qualified workers 2, 3, 4 years after, promoting egregious employment practices. So it does tend to follow you. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. So be careful. All righty,
Indeed.
let's move on.
Okay. Professionally assertive communication. Be the person you want to work with. When you're self-advocating, be open, friendly, and yes, assertive. Assertive doesn't mean pushy. It just means saying who you are, what is best for you, and putting it out there. Things like that. Remember, negotiation, not demands. Work to understand and to be understood. It's a mutual situation. It's our responsibility both to make the other person understand what we have by saying, you get what I'm saying, and also it's our responsibility to make sure we understand what they're saying. Everybody has to give 100%. Frame outcomes and strengths. Instead of stating demands, assert how you can do your best. Not, I can't work in that queue, but I do much better in a distraction-free environment. That's how I want to work. Again, you're putting it out there. This is what works for me. It's like that. Asset-based language. Again, building on your strengths, not the weaknesses. I have an incredible focus and can get tons done when I'm not distracted. So what I do is to find a way to protect chunks of my time to be at my very best. Now, I got to be all by myself and I can't get interrupted and things like that. Again, putting it out there in a positive way, stating who you are, stating your truth tends to be very good. Jen, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that, it's really important and it's hard. It's hard because when things change or when we find that we're in a situation where we're not able to do our best, we tend, and I know I do this, I tend to focus on why I can't do my best rather than reframing it as this is what I need to, get work done. Certainly in my own company, this, Keith, I cut off Mondays. I'm not meeting with anyone on Mondays.
Yeah.
Why? Because I have to get work done. And that was a little distressing, I think, for folks because I had a couple of standing meetings on Monday. But I just said, I have so much going on the rest of the week that the only way I can carve out time to do my writing, to do updating my curriculum, to do things like this, which was done on a Monday, is I have to protect that time, right? And that was me advocating for myself. How do I get this work done? I have no interruptions. I don't check my email as frequently. I don't have meetings. I don't answer the phone unless it's urgent. And that's how I, had to advocate in my own company. Yeah, it's very true. What we do. Okay.
Good.
So what works for you? Finding communication strategies that work. And everybody's different, right? We know that. And so how it works for you is going to be different than how it works for other people. But, the type of things that we see in, the commonalities are here. So first is sharing information. How does your organization share information? It could be in Slack, it could be, Google Docs, it could be daily stand-ups, it could be all of those. Take stock of how you're getting and sharing information. Can you make the company norms work for you? Now, for things like Slack, I recommend, if you find yourself interrupted all the time by Slack, which many people do, turn it off for a couple hours and turn it back on, catch up, turn it off again, and tell people you're doing that because you're getting work done. Google Docs are a great way to share information, whether or not it's like, look, I'm head down in this, project. I won't pop back up until later in the day. That's all advocating for yourself. How else are you sharing information? So the daily stand-ups. Are the daily stand-ups productive? Are you helping to make them productive, right? That's another way to advocate for yourself rather than just showing up to the stand-up and not saying anything. Bring things up. I'm really struggling with XYZ and I could use some help. Or I can't access still, that one file that I need to work on. Can somebody here help me? which leads me to the next point, participation. This is another critique I hear a lot
Mm-hmm.
on performance improvement plans. They are not participating in meetings or in group chats or what have you. So it's important to be able to participate in some, but maybe not all meetings. So before you run into a meeting, take 3 minutes to think about what that meeting is, what you might be asked, what questions you might have, and jot them down. Have them front of mind so you're not walking in from your last meeting or from finishing something up. Actually go into a meeting to participate mindfully. That's really important. That's something we can all do. And speaking up, being able to interject can be difficult. I've been to many meetings where everybody's talking over everybody, nobody's paying attention, they're on their phone, they're doing whatever. So if you're struggling to participate and you have something to say, raise your hand, literally. Yes, it feels weird, right? Because nobody else is raising their hand. They're just talking over each other. People will notice if you're raising your hand. The room will quiet down and you'll be able to see what or say what you have to say. Even if you have to go back to a previous topic, I know we moved on to Y, but I've got questions about X. We need to talk about X and go back to that, right? That's perfectly okay. So try to find those ways to communicate, advocate for what you need through, daily communications, participating in meetings, speaking up in meetings or in, smaller groups. Keith?
A little bit on one, like part one, the sharing of information. What I've mentioned to a number of clients who had problems because they were constantly being interrupted by Slack and email and so on, was to suggest saying, figure out for you what your best time of being able to get things done is, what your core hours would be, and then tell stakeholders and say, hey, folks, I'm going to be working during these hours pretty much uninterruptedly. You know, so if you send me a message, I'll respond afterwards, or you can reach me beforehand. If it's an emergency or very urgent as defined by X, Y, and Z, otherwise everything will be urgent in an emergency. Feel free to, text me or something like that. But that way you're able to let everybody know works best for you and satisfying their need for communication.
Absolutely. And that's priceless. And that's exactly what I would want people to do. If you need to carve time out and shut down your communication, that's fine, but do post it so other people know. And certainly for your most important stakeholders, e.g. your boss and maybe your team lead, make sure that they can text you.
Mhm.
Because sometimes something truly horrible does happen that needs your attention. So we want them to have a way to get in touch with you. If they abuse it and they're constantly, and Lord knows I've seen that, then that's a time to sit down with your manager and say, look, I know you wanted to get a hold of me, but I got to finish this project you wanted me to finish. I, have carved this time out on purpose so that I can get that work done. Is this really so urgent that I stop that work and do this for you now?
Mhm.
Managers oftentimes communicate, team leads do too, when they're thinking of it, right? Regardless, they just want it off their plate so they don't have to think about it again. But that can put too much of a burden on their employees. They need to send it an email or a Slack and know that you'll get to it later. Absolutely. All right. Next.
Yeah. And what we've described working, first thing, which is to say, if you're needing to advocate isn't working, start out, what is it you need? Being able to advocate means understanding your needs, understanding more or less what can be given, what they can do, what is reasonable, and negotiating. Start with what you need reasonably. And two, be clear but not demanding. Again, stating things as, I work best when, as opposed to, I gotta have this or I can't have that. Do the, do the former, not the latter. See if you can get clarification if you don't know after the meeting. Describe how you do better without distraction. Give examples of why this works for you and so on. And then follow up an email. This is something that I try to do quite frequently in many of the places I've worked before. When my manager or someone says, do something, says, I understand you are looking for X, Y, and Z. Am I getting that correctly? And yes or no. But anyway, that gets it down in writing, what it is, how they want it, when they need it done. So help me along. No, it's a good idea to follow up with a quick email saying, I understand you'll be looking to ways to make this meetings less chaotic so we can all participate, or some such, as an example. So those are some various things. One, another thing, and I'd like to sort of pick up off of what we have here and sort of what's not being asked, or, sometimes being contrarian, as you've seen, Brenda, is what we've discussed here seems to be very reasonable. I mean, it's designed to be sensible, practical, and so on. What is often difficult is that, say, someone might be reading this and say, okay, I need to ask for things reasonable, I need to be clear. I don't know how to do that yet. It's not that I won't do that. It's not that I'm scared to do that. It's just I don't know really at this point what is reasonable. How do you figure that out? So what I'm thinking of, needs to ask is, for these various things that are suggested, what do you do as far as doing a reality check? How do you find out if something you ask for is truly reasonable if you don't want to let go right to the boss? Jenny, any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I would say that I've seen this one happen many times too. So I think, sometimes people work with a therapist, for example, to design accommodation requests, for example. And I'm not saying all, but maybe many therapists don't really have an understanding of reasonable as it might pertain to ADA. And so I would say best to work with a job coach, best to work with somebody who has deep knowledge of how companies actually work on the inside before you start asking for, kind of, far-reaching accommodations. I do, to this last point about following up an email, this is a good old-fashioned CYA trick, right?
Yep.
To really make sure that you're understanding what they've said. Because oftentimes, especially when things are already tense, communication breaks down. And we want to make sure that we are understanding exactly and precisely what our manager or team lead or our coworkers intend, right? Not what we think we heard, not what that we think they said, whatever. And we want to make sure that our point is clear, but in a non-threatening, friendly way. Hey, just wanted to follow up, from our meeting earlier. I really appreciate you talking to me about, how difficult it is to participate in these meetings. And you're going to look into some ways that we might be able to, kind of tone it down a little bit. So however it works, but following up, I think, is important. And it's always important also, in some of these cases, I believe, to talk to somebody who's got practical experience with dealing with difficult work situations. All right.
Good.
So building credibility. This is really key. And, all of us need to be concerned about our credibility in the workplace because it's, I've heard it referred to, it's your brand, which I kind of don't like, but, what's your brand? Because it feels a little bit slippery, but it is important to have good cred. Right? It is important for our coworkers, our bosses, whomever else, our stakeholders, to have, that sense of knowledge that this person does good work and they're consistent. And that's really where we start. Consistent good work, not once in a blue moon, you pull it out of the ashes and do something heroic, but the rest of the time you're not so reliable. It has to be consistent. And in the workplace, that's how you're judged. You're judged on your outcomes, right? How well you performed. And sometimes that means how well you problem solved, how well you broke down barriers to getting the job done, how well you used whatever resources you have, right? So it's not just the work you do, but it's how you work in that environment to get the job done on time, quality, and consistent. That is pretty much what every manager is working for. Looking for. The second is low drama. Oh my gosh, have I had high drama employees in the past? And sometimes they're your very best workers, but they're also problem children, right? They can be. So, the best workers sometimes are hardest to manage. They're the hardest to work with because they have an inflated idea of, well, I'm so good at my job, I can be a jerk and I can badmouth people and I can cause political chaos. Nobody's going to fire me. I'm too good at my job. Well, put that pin in that because down the road that will backfire. I guarantee. It sometimes takes a minute, but the people who are the highest drama tend to have the most rocky careers over time. Be low drama. It doesn't mean be invisible. It doesn't mean being perfect. All of us have our moments, but if you are consistently high drama, you will not have good credibility. Nobody will trust you. They won't be transparent with you. They'll withhold information. You will not get your work done. And helpful. This is another thing I see in performance improvement plans is that you are not available to other people or you're not seen as being helpful to your coworkers. Again, back to grumpy Gus, right? And one way that you can build credibility, I mean, not that you're doing other people's jobs or not that, you're always available, but that people know that if they have a question or if they need help with something, they can approach you. This is an important way to build those allies. Yeah, Grumpy Gus, he can be kind of a pain, but he does bring donuts. And I had a really sticky problem and he just jumped in and gave me a hand and we sorted it out. He's a good guy, right? So all of this helps to build your credibility in the workplace, and it's really, really important. Keith, any quick comments on this?
Just a little bit of low drama. I'd like to expand a little on that besides bad mouth, causing chaos, and jerk. You can be none of these things, but you can still be really annoying and you in trouble. So basically, low drama, low maintenance, don't do those things. Don't be a pain in the ass. Excuse me, Brenda. Uh, and that should help out. You
Yeah.
know, being friendly, helpful, and useful usually is a plus.
Yes, absolutely. All right. And here's just a quick story. We're almost out of time. Long ago, a mom needed to ensure that her kids' peers were nice to her kid and that the teachers took the time to understand him and that the school did its part to support him. Of course, I'm talking about myself. She made it all but impossible for people to disregard her kid. And how I did that was I did everything I could think of for other kids, for the teachers, and for the school so that I had outstanding credibility and I had currency in the community. And what that meant was nobody was going to be mean to my kid. So sometimes it's a halo effect, right? You can bring your whole department down and be seen as a department as being difficult to work with. You can also, the reverse is true. If people have a negative idea about working with your department, you can be the one person who does everything or goes the extra mile to ensure that the reputation is maintained, right? I highly recommend people think about that. So going through this real quickly, know thyself. You must know who you are, what you're good at, and what you're not good at, and how people perceive you. You need to learn how to accept feedback. None of us really enjoy constructive criticism, but it's an important way to see how the world sees us. Learn the art of the ask. Negotiation makes for good relationships, Demands make for courtroom drama, right? I don't want to see on Judge Judy. Work on your communication. All of us, even people who are fabulous at communication, need to work on it all the time. We all have down days. We all get snippish from time to time. That's okay. Continue to learn new techniques, new skills that foster good interpersonal communication, because I got news for you. That is part of the workplace. And work on your credibility. People who do well typically are consistent performers with low drama. Bosses will do a lot to hang on to those people. And then we have a few things here. A couple of these are really great. So the art or Getting to Yes has been around forever, but it's a really good book. I haven't read it for a while. I need to read it again. And then there's another one called Negotiating that I think is a really good book. And then there's two articles here, one from Forbes, one I forget where the other ones were, or where it is, but it's how people build trust in the workforce. And both of these are. And I really think they're good reads. So something to take a look at. And then last but not least, what we're doing next week, next week, your professional development. So this goes along with this particular talk. We want to talk about how do you develop your own career. Used to be back in the day, you'd work very closely with your management to build your professional development. Not so much anymore. It really is more DIY, which is okay. But again, you will need those advocacy skills if you're going to continue to develop your career within that organization. So we'll talk about that. And that is it. And thank you so much for coming today. We are just right at noon. Brenda, did you have a question, my dear? Whoops, hang on a second. Let me see if I can see. I cannot. Let me just look here. I'm looking for, so this is really weird, Brenda. Before you logged on, Keith and I were kind of confused as to why the interface has changed here and why we can't see anything. So in Q&A, if you have a question, pop it in. Other than that, you have my email. Shoot an email. Going, gone. All right. Good to see everyone. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Oh, good. Oh,
here it is. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. Take good care. We'll talk to everybody later.